All right, folks, this is going to be a quick overview of chapter 26 and the post-war tensions coming back from the war. Okay. So here's a political cartoon. If we can kind of look at some similarities and differences. Okay, November 11th, 1918. The date's significant because November 11th is the day that the war ended. Right, so in 1918, America's enemy was Germany, and notice it's interesting that this is a white flag. Germany's finally surrendering. The background's all destroyed. The city's destroyed. A year later, we've got radical communists. This is the new enemy. So this begins an era of where the U.S. has to identify some sort of enemy, and that trend's going to continue all the way through, well, pretty much today. This is a popular, this is Wall Street, and clearly something has happened here. Usually we had a class discussion on this, but this was a car bombing, protesting. We're going to see a lot of violence upon the return of the war. Okay? So the essential question, what effects do post-war tensions have on the American ideals? Remember our American ideals. You're asked that every unit test. So hint, hint, clue, clue, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. These are the main issues. We're going to look at tensions. We're going to look at the causes, and then we're going to look at the effects in this PowerPoint. Okay, so the economy, labor, which are related, political, social, and racial, which are related. Okay. All right. Economic tensions, causes. So when the war ended, the government didn't really plan on how we were going to move from wartime to peacetime, and that created some issues. And what I mean by that is, the government has asked a bunch of factories. Instead of making toys, or instead of making, jeans or T-shirts or blouses or purses, we're asking you to make bullets and uniforms and canteens and stuff. Now the war is over, and the government didn't do anything to help, get us back to a normal economy, okay? Both in production, but also with food and transportation, and gas. So this creates a lot of chaos. Okay, our economy was doing quite well during the war production, but now the government just abruptly cancels all the contracts. Okay, so you've got these factories with all this stockpile of stuff to make things for war, brass casings for bullets, olive green cloth for uniforms. Well, now there's no more uniforms needing to be made, and I'm a factory owner, and I've got, 1,700 bolts of olive green fabric. What the heck am I going to do with that? Okay, that's a problem. Plus, you've got 4 million people coming back to the United States, and they're going to want to work. They're going to need a job. So the demand for peacetime goods caused prices to rise because there was a shortage of peacetime goods. Purses, blouses, jeans, tennis shoes, boots, normal boots, not war boots. All the normal stuff we have, nobody was making that. And now there's a huge demand for it, and so those prices skyrocket. On the flip side, hundreds of factories are closing because they can't afford to switch back over to what they had before. The government helped them out to move to the war stuff, and now these factories are closing, or they've got stockpiles of stuff that they can't get rid of. Standard of living. So, standard of living is basic expectations of how I want to live my life. For us, like today, standard of living is you probably have Wi-Fi at home. You probably subscribe to Netflix. You probably have at least 2 to 5 TVs or screens in your house. You may have, 2 cars at least. That's a standard of living. Now take all that down. Okay, no more Wi-Fi. Maybe only 1 car. Maybe only 1 screen. That's to decrease the standard of living. Okay, and we start sliding into a recession. Okay? Because we slide into a recession, crime goes up. All right, the more poor people we have, typically the higher the crime rate is going to be. So the causes of labor tensions. So you've got this backdrop, this economic backdrop. We've got a recession. Government's no longer encouraging good relations between the worker and the employee or the employer. Okay? Before they were, because we needed women in the workforce. We needed African Americans in the factories. So factory owners, be good to them. Okay, give them a decent wage so that they're going to work for the war cause. Now we don't need that. So now it's like, too bad, worker. You're gonna take a pay cut. Corporations reduce wages. Less attention paid to worker safety. It's kind of going back to the time of the jungle at the turn of the century. That, of course, ticks off the workers. So they join unions, and there's more strikes, and there's more dissent, and workers are starting to lose economic ground. Before I left for the war, I was working, I was making a good wage. Now I'm not. Okay? During the war, if I was a woman or an African American, I was making good money. Now I'm not. So I'm upset. I'm losing economic ground. Okay? And we see lots of strikes. And we see lots of turmoil. I believe this is pictures from Chicago, the Pullman strike. Pullman had Pullman Town on the southwest side where they made these type of trolley cars and railroad cars. Okay? But you had to live in the town, and basically, once you signed the contract, you were stuck there and you were going to live in debt for the rest of your life. Union membership, obviously, we see a huge rise here with big immigration. We looked at this during the progressives. This is why the progressives were trying to make changes. And so we see similar here in the 1920s. Political tension. So here are the causes. So we just talked about the labor and the economic. So now the political tension causes. Well, in the summer or the spring of 1919, 36 bombs across the country were discovered. The term radicalism, favoring extreme change. In our current political situation, one party has been labeled by the other as radicals. Okay, I'll let you try to figure out which one's which. There was a huge growing fear of socialists, communists, and anarchists. We are seeing a little bit of that today in our political climate. One political group is being labeled socialists, even though they're not socialists. Okay? They haven't gone as far as labeling them communists or anarchists yet. Although, well, I should say that. During this summer, there were some anarchists being claimed in part of the riots. Communism is a philosophy that favors worker ownership of all the production of the factories and the food, and usually through a revolution. So that's one of the reasons why, obviously if you're a business owner, a factory owner, you are fearful of communists because they want to overthrow you. In June, so in April, 36 bombs were discovered. In June, bombs went off in 8 cities. Right. One actually targeted the Attorney General. Well, we've seen something similar. About a month ago, some militia, they didn't use bombs, but they had guns. They had not AKs, they had AR-15s. I guess they did have some bombs. They had grenades. There was a bad attempt to storm Michigan's governor mansion and kidnap the governor of Michigan in lieu of the election. Palmer, he was the target. He then launches this huge Red Scare, okay, where now the whole country becomes fearful of communists. And he would target suspected radicals who were mostly immigrants because they were also mostly poor, couldn't speak English very well, didn't know their rights, and were often treated poorly both in the workplace and in society. Their homes and businesses were raided. Many of them were arrested without due cause, without rights. Okay, so their civil liberties, their rights. So going back to your essay question, right? Okay. The rights are being violated. We don't have Miranda yet. Miranda is you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. That does not exist yet. So police officers could come and arrest you and not tell you what you're being arrested for. They didn't have to show you a search warrant. They could just come in, break down your door. So it was kind of scary times. A couple more political cartoons here. Bolshevism. The Bolsheviks were the political party in the Soviet Union or in Russia that overthrew the Tsar. Okay, and so here we're obviously being labeled as communists are going to bring anarchy to our system. Here's yet another political cartoon. You've got the American flag, but all the white and the blue's been torn. leaving just the color red. So those are the causes of political tensions, and now here are some causes to the social tensions. Okay? Immigration picks up again. Okay, so we're seeing repeat and repeat, right? In the 1900s, we had a lot of immigrants come, and there was backlash. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So then there was the war. No immigrants allowed in because we don't know if you're a spy. And now the war's over. So all of those destitutes in Europe are coming back, or coming over to America. Okay, they're from Southern and Eastern Europe. So they look and they speak differently than the first wave that came from, say, Ireland and England and Germany. Nativists, these are people who claim to have been born in America, so I'm an American, even though they're not Native American. They're born here, so they think they have more rights than immigration. They want restrictions. You can't let all these people come over here. They're taking our jobs. Okay? Union membership actually favored this because a lot of the nativists were becoming union members and they wanted to protect their job from immigrants. So they were supporting this. Quota system. A quota is a number, a limited number. So we have a quota. We're only going to allow X number of people from England in. We're only going to allow X number of people from Italy in. So a quota system was enacted. The KKK is revived. Okay, it saw a decline, and now all of a sudden, this actually revival here is what kind of redefines the entire South, Southern pride, and the sense of the Confederate flag that we see today. Okay? They would target immigrants, African Americans, and Catholics. Okay? Because Catholics were not seen as Protestants. Obviously, these two were not considered, Americans. In 1919, they had 83 lynchings. Okay? They adopted the battle flag of the Confederate States of America. So the Confederate flag that we see now, that's actually not the original Confederate flag. That was adopted by the KKK in 1919. Okay, so all the trucks with the Confederate flags on them, it comes out of this revival. And it doesn't have anything to do with defending Southern pride. It has to do with defending or keeping African Americans in their place. Okay? This is when they also erected monuments throughout the South of all of those Confederate generals. So in the beginning of the school year, we talked about how these monuments were starting to come down. Those monuments were not erected to honor the generals at the end of the Confederate Civil War. Excuse me. So they weren't made in 1865, 1870, 1880. They were made in the 1919s and in the 1920s purposely to instill fear in African Americans. So the backlash to that is the American Civil Liberties Union is created. This was created to help protect your freedom of speech. If you were being arrested for your freedom of speech, this organization would come and help represent you in a court of law. Okay. Civil liberties, again, are just the basic rights. So again, thinking back to your essay question here, right? When did we live up to rights? When did we live up to liberty or freedom? When did we not? Hint, hint, clue. Okay. So here again are just a different area. Go away. Southern Europe, Italy, Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland. Whoa, come back here. Another political cartoon. We would normally analyze this. KKK marched down. There's the capital of the United States, right? Famous parade. So this was seen as mainstream. Okay, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was considered American, and only white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Usually with a male attached to it, because men were seen higher than women. So the Sacco and Vanzetti case, you've already kind of watched, so I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. You saw that video. So here again, we think that they did not receive a fair trial. The judge was already biased, hated immigrants. Both were executed, some of which on circumstantial evidence. So we're going to skip this video because we've already seen it. Okay. Here again, you have a lot of Italian Americans rallying for support. Racial tension. So we've seen economic, we've seen political, we've seen social. Now we're looking at racial. So African Americans are continuing racism, facing racism. The lynchings are increasing. We saw that number earlier. Intimidation, Jim Crow laws, and fear were put to keep them in their place. And we might be seeing some of this in today, the last summer, with the police brutality. There was also a rise in anti-Semitism. These are prejudice against Jews. And then, of course, Catholics were also targeted for religious prejudice because they were not Protestant. They still claimed allegiance to the Pope. The effects of these racial tensions. So we've got race riots in the summer of 1919 nationwide, right? We called it the Red Summer, right? We're just now coming off of 2020, a similar type of summer. We've got the George Floyd, but there were many others of racial tension and police brutality that led to riots. The worst example was right here in Chicago, Illinois. A young African-American teen who was swimming in Lake Michigan drifted into the white section only, and he was then stoned and drowned. And police refused not only to arrest the white suspects, but they arrested a black teenager. Okay. That arrest of the black teenager led to 13 days of riots, where you've got obviously quite a few dead and over 1,000 black homeless. There's a map looking at just exactly, look at Georgia. Georgia had 7 in itself. Okay, this is in one summer. Now, obviously, this was worse than the summer of 2020, but 2020 certainly had its significant issues with police brutality and African Americans. We click this, we're going to have a short video.
In the midst of a war, not a war between nations, but a war between races, whites versus blacks, riots in the streets and dozens left dead. This is the story of the event that would be remembered in history as the Red Summer. The Red Summer of 1919 was the breaking point of the ever-rising tensions surrounding the migration during World War I of African Americans from the South to the cities in the North. Once the war was over, thousands of soldiers returned home to find their jobs in factories filled by previously Southern blacks. Radical and ethical prejudices were all over. Adding to the tension was how little freedom African American soldiers had once they returned home, being denied basic rights such as adequate housing and equality under the law. During this time, the white supremacist group Ku Klux Klan revived its violent acts throughout the South. During the summer of 1919, riots across the U.S. would break out in areas like Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, and many more. None, though, were as dramatic as the events that occurred in Chicago. It was July 27, 1919, the fateful day that would cause the next week to rain violence on the streets of Chicago. Eugene Williams, an African-American citizen, had gone with some friends to swim at their local beach. In the midst of everything, Eugene crossed the lines between the blacks and the white sides, and soon Eugene was being stoned from the beach side by a group of white men. Eugene was struck and then drowned. When the police arrived at the scene and were informed of the situation by several eyewitnesses, the officers refused to arrest the white men. Instead, the police arrested a black man. Black bystanders watched and objected only to be met with violence by the whites. Soon, white and black mobs had erupted all over the city. Lasting nearly a week, the Chicago riots were finally coming to a close after the government had deployed 6,000 National Guard infantrymen. These men were stationed around the Black Belt to prevent any further white attacks. By the evening of July 30th, most violence had ended. The majority of the rioting, murder, and arson was the result of white ethnic groups attacking the African American population in the city's Black Belt on the south side. Most of the casualties and property damage were suffered by the black Chicagoans. Over the 5 days, a total of 38 people had been killed, 23 of those being African American and 15 being white, along with 537 injuries, 2/3 of that being African American. By the end of the riots, approximately 1,000 residents, mostly African American, were left homeless due to arson attacks. Many African American families had left by train before the rioting ended, returning to their families in the South. It was suggested to implement zoning laws that would formally segregate housing in Chicago and place restrictions preventing blacks from working alongside whites in the stockyard, though these measures were rejected by African American and liberal white voters. President Woodrow Wilson publicly blamed the whites for being the instigators of the race-related riots in both Chicago and Washington, D.C., and introduced efforts to foster racial harmony, including voluntary organizations and congressional legislation. The summer of 1919, later to be known as the Red Summer, marked the beginning of a growing willingness amongst African Americans to fight for their rights in the face of oppression and injustice.
So, a couple of things there. Woodrow Wilson, he was at the end of that video there, he was kind of in favor of calling for racial equality. That's a change in tune. Woodrow Wilson is considered one of the most racist presidents we've ever had. He showed the controversial film Birth of a Nation, which really kind of cements the whole stereotypes and fears of African Americans, especially African American males. And so by 1919, Woodrow had to kind of change his tune to get back the women, and the black votes in the North. So he tried to dispel these riots. Marcus Garvey comes out and he has his Back to Africa movement. He would like all African Americans to move back to Africa. The U.S. government should pay for them to go back there and set up shop basically back home in their homeland. Now, Abraham Lincoln, during the tail end of the Civil War, did allocate money, and there is a country. It's not Sierra Leone. He tried to help set up a country over there for any blacks who wanted to move back. It didn't really become popular in Lincoln's time, but Marcus Garvey is bringing that concept back. He also brings back the concept of this black nationalism, black pride, black power founded here. Okay, so he becomes an influence to Mandela, Martin Luther King, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, and of course we can probably see some ties, to Black Lives Matter today. Okay, they could probably trace their roots to this notion of some black pride. Another effect was the formation of the Anti-Defamation League. That was to try to end anti-Semitism or try to quell any sort of anti-Jewish feelings. Okay. This is a short video on Marcus Garvey. I'm going to let you play that at your leisure because this video is starting to run long. And with that, I believe we will end.